Amen. I know that there's a lot of healing work that we need to do. And I know that there's a lot of folks who are still struggling and reeling about what's been happening in our community, whether it's fires or hurt and antagonism and anti-Semitism. We're going to spend a little time tonight talking about some of that anti-Semitism that we've been seeing on news. We know that's been happening around the country, around the world. So I guess I want to start. I think I'm a lot like a lot of folks. We don't see it so much for our kids around here. It's there, but I felt it was much more tangible when I was a kid. I remember very clearly having kids throw pennies at me because I was Jewish. I remember folks making swastikas on my locker for the football team from the other kids on the football team. I remember they even killed a rabbit and hung it from the goalposts from that same football team, also with swastikas all around the area. Why, I remember thinking, did they target me this way? And I lived on Long Island, where we all think that it's like a Jewish Mecca, but it's not really the case. I grew up in a very strongly identified Jewish family, much more so than my friends. They might have belonged even to conservative synagogues, but they weren't as engaged as my family was, for sure. And it made for some loneliness. There's no question about it for me. It made for some loneliness, the kind of loneliness that you hear about regarding people who are recent immigrants, and language or culture or art or food that they brought to school seemed different to other people, and so it was a struggle for lots of them. But I wasn't an immigrant. I was also born and raised in the same house on East Meadow on Long Island. My family before me wasn't super connected Jewishly until my older sister, who's much older than I am, she was asking why she wasn't having a bat mitzvah, becoming bat mitzvah, the way all of her friends were. It's funny, thinking back, because my mother's first language was Yiddish, and she was born in New York. She didn't learn English until she went to kindergarten. And yet my family was totally disconnected from Jewish life. Not so much from community, from relatives, with all of these old school names from Eastern Europe, but they were disconnected. But my sister really pushed the argument, and it made a transition so that she would become bat mitzvah, and that led to them joining the synagogue, which led them to having a kosher house, which my father tolerated. But when he needed something really important, we had paper plates ready for the porch outside. From the kosher home, it led to my mother becoming a religious school teacher, because she already knew Hebrew and Yiddish. And eventually, she became a religious school principal. They didn't call them educators, they called them principals back then. And I was a later in life baby. So I was the product of a family that returned to tradition in a very deep way. My growing up was with Jewish and Israeli books lining my house growing up. After Shabbat dinner, Friday night dinner, we would move the furniture in our living room, and we had our own version of Israeli folk dancing with records. We all remember records. I had a tzedakah box next to the telephone for Jewish National Fund, that whenever we made long-distance calls, we had to put some money in it for JNF and to buy trees in Israel. We also used it when I would use inappropriate, colorful language as a child. I would have to put some into that JNF pushka. And that is all to say that when it was time for me to go to school, in elementary school, through high school, I wore T-shirts with Hebrew or something about Israel. I would share my name out loud as a young child because I thought it was so cool that I had this Hebrew name. And I would use these Yiddish words that I heard in my family, but nobody else in school knew them. So yeah, it was kind of easy for me to be this target. Pennies, Jewish slurs, and swastikas. It made me angry. I got into my share of fights. It made my mom cry. And it made my dad show me how to fight. He was an avid boxing fan, and his hands were kind of thick like sledgehammers. So when I grew up, anti-Semitism was always around. It was just normative. We knew that any of us could face a challenge. But as I grew up, and I went to university, and I traveled to Israel, and I came back, and I started living into my 20s. I enter into rabbinical school. I see the world changing. People love Spielberg and Streisand. They never have anything bad to say. I know there's anti-Semites, but it's not like it was in the public square the way it was. Somebody would make a faux pas once in a while, some kind of mistake. But it seemed to have been changing. Anti-Semitism was for the extremists on the sides, not having a seat at the table. I was thinking the world was becoming more tolerant, more thoughtful, more equitable, and I was wrong. I remember thinking when I was first ordained, and that's more than 20 years ago now, that I would never make the big anti-Semitism sermons the way my rabbi did, because things were going to be different, and things in our country were getting better. France, I knew, was a struggle, other countries still a struggle, but it could never happen here in America, and I believed it. What is anti-Semitism anyway? Some people will say that it's just about this antagonism or hatred or saying not nice things against Jews or Judaism, and I think it's much more complicated than that. Early on, there's a history of anti-Jewish hatred for not following the majority religion of Christianity. It was a hatred based on religious terms. The Jews' rejection of a Christian Redeemer, and eventually the expanded accusations not just about Jews rejecting Jesus as the Redeemer, but also being the cause of his death. Allegations of Christ killer evolved into something called blood libels in the Middle Ages. Blood libels are when medieval Christian communities would accuse Jews of taking Christian children, sacrificing them, and using their blood for our Passover rituals. This is well documented. This wasn't one or two things. There's a lot of historical evidence that shows it in art and in literature and even in this country. In 1928, we had our own blood libel in upstate New York. Now, as time went on, hatred towards Jews transitioned in two other kinds of ways. One was a result of pseudoscience. It's not real science. But people in the 1700s and 1800s believed that this was real, cutting-edge science and intellectual ideas, and their pseudoscience and racial theories and eugenics classified Jews as weak, as inferior, as dangerous intruders into the human race. In other words, not fully human. Most years without COVID, we take our high school students to Washington, D.C. to go to the United States Holocaust Museum. And I'm drawn to this one panel of images in the museum that talk about the Nazis' science, or in Germany, scientists measuring a Jew's nose, and how big his head was, and comparing that in data form to white Aryans of Germany, proving an inferior race. It's amazing. There's a third image. We talked a little bit about the this thing is driving me crazy, the religious idea. We talked about the pseudoscience, and the third one emerges from Jews being put in a position of collecting taxes and collecting interest, being money lenders. You know, in Jewish tradition, a Jew can't ask another Jew of interest, in business. And that was true in the Christian world too. So, since Christians were the majority, Jews often were in these money lending roles. That was a place where they could be pushed into. So that's what they did. And how many of us just love the IRS and think that it's our favorite institution in the country? Whenever somebody's going to take something out of our pockets, we tend to feel a little bit of resentment or anger. And that's what happens towards the Jewish community. Jews moved into this space and was used to illustrate how Jews were greedy or cheats or cheap. The kind of propaganda that evolved into one of the greatest, most well-known phony documents coming out of Tsarist Russia, called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. These protocols depicted worldwide Jewish conspiracy because Jews owned the banks and the media and all of the major institutions. I was never invited to a meeting, and I'm waiting for my cut. I bet so are you. It's ridiculous. And by the way, the document is still available on Amazon.com. So you have three shades of anti-Semitism that is out there: religious-based, racial-based, and money and power antagonism-based. And this is what we're seeing. With the hostage-taking a few weeks ago at the synagogue in Texas. Why them? Because the Jews had the power to release somebody from federal prison. Whoopi Goldberg's error the other day. I think it's sad that somebody of her integrity doesn't have a bigger picture, and she owned it and apologized. I think became a model for listening and apology. And that is something worth acknowledging and respecting. We should all be able to listen, acknowledge, and apologize. One of our students in this congregation this week got an email with a swastika inside of a Jewish star. Some kid thinking that it's funny. It's not the only one. These issues are still real. So what do? I told you my experience that it was always around me. Then I thought it was kind of over, mostly in this country, except for the fringes. Now we feel like it's pretty thick again. Colorado has one of the highest rates in the country. What are we going to do? We saw three kinds of anti-Semitism, three versions of the same beast. So now what do? I think there's people that are talking about security, and that's important. And if people are going to come into our house, we have to take care of them. But that's not how we fight anti-Semitism. Dr. Deborah Lipstadt, who's a scholar of the history of the Holocaust at Emory University in Atlanta, she wrote a piece in the Forward a couple of years ago reflecting on the attempted massacre in a synagogue in Halle, Germany. Do you remember this? A gunman tried to get into the synagogue right after the Pittsburgh synagogue attack, and the attack on the mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand. Well, somebody tried to get entry into this German synagogue on Yom Kippur with the intentions to open fire, and he was unable to enter. He killed 2 other people that were nearby. And Deborah Lipstadt, wrote a piece called "The Best Way to Fight Anti-Semitism." She put a colon there, and she gave the answer: Jewish joy. I'm with Lipstadt. Jewish joy. A historian of anti-Semitism says something dramatic and poignant. She wrote at that time, "As much as I worry about what anti-Semites might do to Jews, I worry even more about what we might do to ourselves because of anti-Semitism." She nor I want us to celebrate Judaism as an act of defiance or to be anti-Semitism. Everyone should be anti-Semitism. I'm anti-racism. I'm anti-xenophobia. I'm in favor of everybody trying to be the best person that they could possibly be without hurting another. What does it mean to be anti-Semitism? God bless you. It means to be human. So what should we do? What do we really do? I think when we learn about attacks, we should respond with tzedakah to help and heal a broken world. When we hear about vandalism, we buy a Jewish book and donate it to the public library. For every anti-Semitic act and accusation, news piece, take it as an opportunity to engage in a mitzvah. You want to say a mitzvah is a commandment? Great. You want to call it a Jewish sacred responsibility? Groovy. You want to see it as an invitation to do Jewish? Love that. Pick. However you take mitzvah and own it, that's what we're going to respond with. We hear something about hurting the Jewish community, we light Shabbat candles, if that's not your typical practice. Invite friends for Shabbat dinner, even if it has to be on Zoom. Show up at synagogue, even online. Send some tzedakah to help us support an Afghan refugee family on our campus fleeing the Taliban. I want to share this for my conclusion with you. And I just saw it today, and I thought it was pretty outstanding. Jordana Horn is a journalist, and she writes on this blog for Jewish parenting called Kveller. Kveller, K-V-E-L-L-E-R, like when my grandmother would kvell, like, do we know that word? Some of us? Good. So it's called Kveller. So this Jewish news site for families and a blog, it's a great piece, and she wants to remind us about not hiding who we are. So she already had me at hello. I was with her. And she wants us to remember that Jewish life and Judaism matter not just to me or her as individuals, but it matters to the world. I'm still with her. And then she quotes Michael Twitty. Michael Twitty is a black and Jewish culinary historian and author of Kosher Soul. It's kind of cool. You should check it out. Kosher Soul. And he shared his reflections on Twitter recently. He called it the 50 Joys of Jewish. He says, we aren't just traumas and issues. We aren't, oh hell, what's up with him now? We are our joys and things that are happy or peaceful or satisfying or substantial. That's who we are. She says he follows up with this gorgeous, she says, nice, he follows up with this gorgeous list of wonderful things that he loves about being Jewish, and added, 100 blessings a day mean you look for every single thing to appreciate about being alive every day. Twitty knows that in Jewish tradition there's a teaching that we should say 100 blessings every day. So he wants to say 100 blessings a day means you look for every single thing to appreciate about being alive. And then Jordana Horn, the journalist, she writes this. In a world where non-Jews are always trying to tell me who I am, I will remind myself, and I'll remind you too, we are 100 blessings a day. We are history and laws and fighters for justice. We are ephemeral shelters from the storm. We are artists. We are thinkers. We are wordsmiths. We are family. And we will always try to be lights. We will always try to be lights, flickering against the darkness that tries to consume us.